Meaningless, meaningless, meaningless. Everything is meaningless. Thus says the teacher, observing the world in which he lived. Generations come, generations go. The wind blows in one direction, then in another. The streams run to the sea. The sea is never filled. The author of Ecclesiastes has angst, Weltschmerz, and ennui, all wrapped up into one in an existential muddle. All things are wearisome, more than one can express. The eye is not satisfied with seeing, or the ear with hearing. Everything that happens has happened before. There is nothing new under the sun. Does this sound familiar? Work for the weekend, meaningless. Get to the holidays, meaningless. Work, eat, sleep, work, eat, sleep, work, eat, sleep. Meaningless. There is nowhere you can go that someone hasn't been there before. There's nothing you can do. There is nothing new under the sun. Meaningless. In this search for meaning, Koheleth posits at least an observance of order. There is a time for everything. There's a space marked out by God that has seasons and a beginning and an end. And even though we can't fathom it, we can't know it, God has placed a desire for time in our hearts. There's something of himself, a glimpse beyond the meaninglessness, the repetitiveness of the present, where God is actually in control. Nothing can be taken away and nothing added. This eternity in our hearts is Lewis's natural law, that sense we talked about yesterday, that so many of us have, that there's a way that the world should be, and it isn't. In our contemporary world, we silence even this voice that speaks from the creation of seasons and times and rhythms, and an unfolding not only of random occurrences, but of God's very purposes in the world. Our postmodern lives have conflated time and blended the seasons so that even the voice of the transcendent within the immanent is overlooked. In the busyness of life, the hurrying to get to the next task, the next week, the next thing, it all starts to look the same. I remember once in London, I set a task for my students where they would have to take the tube, the subway, into central London, but without actually going anywhere. They were to ride the tube, travel through the stations at leisure, just in quiet conversation with God, listening for him, and then observe. Did they feel in sync or out of sync with the rhythms of the city? How could we foster an urban practice that allowed us to separate God's time from the pressured clocks? Most of the students found this a profound exercise. They were used to coming in and out of the center of the city with their own agendas for themselves, and they missed the people and the places and the things that on this occasion God would nudge them to notice. Having moved from such an urban context to Wolfville has had a significant impact on me. I would say that even though I'm as busy in my work as I have ever been, perhaps more, simply being close to the land and mindful of the changing seasons seems to have made time slow down for me. In London, it was all the same. One day, 1 week, 1 month, 1 year, it all blended into the next. And it's harder, I think, in that setting for God to grab people's attention. And this reality perplexed Koheleth too, as did so many questions that are still ours today. Are people like animals, he asks? Is there any difference? What makes us human? Why are there people oppressed with no one to comfort them? Why do some people work hard and yet others derive the benefit? Why do some people die before they get to enjoy life? Why are righteous people treated like the wicked and the wicked like the righteous? He could have written this last week. He gets it. The angst we feel when transcendence is gone, the world weariness when injustice reigns, the need to distract ourselves from these thoughts of meaninglessness if we're to carry on in this world in the face of its absurdity. One night, this past summer, as we were tucking into bed, we had the TV turned to BBC World, as is our usual practice. We still live somewhere in the middle of the Atlantic. We were trying to catch the headlines before we wound down for the day. I mean, face it, they sound better with an English accent, right? They do. But we were winding down from the day, and we had BBC World on. I don't know why we do this to wind down. It never works. I was horrified to be watching a tall apartment building on fire, the flames spreading up the outside of the tower as we watched. People were at the windows, visibly distressed. People disappeared from the windows. They were reading out Facebook posts and posting videos and other social media messages that the people inside the tower were trapped and couldn't get out. In essence, that night, we watched people die from the comfort of our cozy bed in a country on the other side of the ocean, a country near and dear to our hearts, but still a world away. And this, of course, has become a usual phenomenon. Who can forget watching an airplane fly into another tower as we watch the aftermath of the first one? We get camera angles from the corner, around the corner when a street battle rages in Mosul. We watch the children scooped up into ambulances where the blood runs freshly over the stones. We've normalized spectator tragedy. Not many weeks later, in the same setting, as I relaxed in bed, well-fed and comfortable and safe, I watched tiny, starving children on the brink of death in Yemen, and then the story turned to the devastating circumstances of the Rohingya Muslims, and they held a bag of skin and bones that belied the dignity of the image bearer, and I couldn't bear to look anymore. And thankfully, the story changed without me having to turn the channel. Oh, good, look. A new iPhone is being released. Just $1,000 separates you from the next step of personal happiness. The malaise kicked in, I admit. I had pangs of Weltschmerz. There is something very wrong with us. It's all conflated. It's all at once. We don't have any benefit of reflection as we run from task to task. And we're confused about where joy fits in the midst of this tragic cultural malaise. Is there really a time to laugh? A time to dance? When is that exactly? We either party to escape, or we party feeling guilty all the while that we get to live while others die. We bear a collective survivor guilt. Survivor guilt is an increasingly well-known phenomenon. It occurs when someone survives a tragedy where others are killed, perhaps in a plane crash or a natural disaster. It occurs most frequently in a form that psychologists see in soldiers returning from conflict, perhaps most recently from Afghanistan, where survivor guilt often accompanies PTSD. It's basically the idea where someone near you has died tragically and you have been spared, either by some notion of random luck or by some greater purpose in the universe. But then you feel guilty that you lived and they did not. Survivor guilt, though, as guilt, may be considered as much a moral issue as a psychological one. The guilt is caught up with the idea that not only did you live and they did not, but you feel guilty because you have some responsibility, that you should have helped the one who died. You should have saved them, but you didn't. Survivors blame themselves, even when they could not really be responsible for what happened. And the moral philosophers have words for this, the way that our moral agency kicks in and makes us feel responsible, and therefore we feel guilty. And yet we do bear moral responsibility, collectively speaking. We sense it. We cannot bear that we're robbed of our agency to do something. We can't bear to continually sit by and watch destruction happen around us without becoming less than human ourselves. I think collective survivor guilt goes some way to describe our moral experience of the tragic malaise of our world. How can I watch a child die, a war being fought, a people murdered, and not feel some sort of moral responsibility for not stepping in? They're right in front of me. It's not as if I don't see, that I don't know. But because of distance, we're separated from the normal rhythms of life. We experience them together. Their want happens at the time of my plenty. Their weeping at the time of my laughing. And it means often we stop laughing and we feel guilty being joyful. And we need to do something, anything that brings order to the chaos of meaninglessness. I was in London not long after watching Grenfell Tower burn. People were upset, frustrated, furious. There was a sense that the people in the tower had been cheated and overlooked because they were mostly immigrants whose building renovations were tinged with cheap flammable cladding that enabled the fire to spread more rapidly than the firefighters could tackle it, whose building renovations did not include sprinkler systems, whose residents had pleaded for improved fire safety for years without response. The anger in the air, the sense that the world is wrong and everything is messed up was completely palpable. It was post-Brexit, post-Trump, post-sanity, it seemed. Well, I went with 2 other theologians to Trafalgar Square for Canada Day. Why wouldn't you? We watched people queue up for hours for a few Timbits. Sad. And we saw Mark Carney, then still Canadian chairman of the Bank of England, play a little hockey with some journalists and some others. Security was tight in the square, but we enjoyed a feeling of good Canadian levity and fun. Before long, I pointed out to my friends the riot police starting to gather at points around the square. It didn't seem like that kind of venue, I thought. Rioting Canadians hurling Timbits at one another. It didn't make sense. I wondered if they had a tip-off about something. Well, we decided we'd leave the square and go somewhere else in central London with our blueberry ice and maple syrup. And our big foam fingers, Canada #1, right? We got just outside the square when we realized that indeed something else was happening. We crossed the road and found ourselves right in the middle, literally in the middle, of a very large, very angry protest, marching down the Mall in one direction and down Whitehall towards Parliament Square in the other. And we saw what was a very diverse group of thousands and thousands of people representing these diverse interests, waving communist flags, flags of Che Guevara, united in their discontent of the way things are. Mostly they were holding placards of Grenfell Tower that proclaimed "Never again." Collective survivor guilt. We've got to do something. Why didn't we do something? Standing in the midst, we said, what's going on? Canadians can do that, right? What's happening? We're protesting against austerity, they said, against everything that's wrong in our society. And by the look of it, there were a lot of people who thought there were a lot of things wrong. Well, we shrugged and we decided to join them. I stole some placards and we walked to Parliament Square. I had told my family I would avoid crowds. But it felt important. It felt like it should be significant. We weren't going to take it anymore. We were recovering our agency. We refused to believe that this is simply meaningless. How can we live in such a meaningless world? We got to Parliament Square and we waited far too long for the much anticipated Labour leader to speak. But people were waiting with such expectation. It was palpable. "Comrades," the speakers addressed the crowds. The communists of Merthyr Tydfil would wave their flags. My Russian colleague, an Old Testament scholar, shook her head. "What do they think they're doing?" she asked. She wasn't sure why my Irish public ethicist friend and I had dragged her into this at all. And we waited. Finally, the moment came. Everybody was waiting for something. But maybe they waited too long. The crowd had thinned. And then the opposition leader didn't have anything helpful or revolutionary or subversive or responsible to say that would help them in this moment of crisis of their malaise, their collective survivor guilt. There was no moral direction, and standing there underneath the towers of Westminster Abbey, part of me wished I could mount the platform. There was a lot that could be said. The crowds dispersed, and we went off to the street food festival and had chicken biryani and West Country cider. It was good. You see, Qoheleth had a sense that there could be meaning somewhere. In the order that he found in nature, he realized that somebody held time, the beginning and the end. And even though we couldn't grasp it, we could trust God, love God, and learn to enjoy our food, our drink, and our work. That's it. Sometimes that's enough meaning. But what Q couldn't know, is that there's something other than the relentless trek towards death when no pleasure is taken in life anymore. And in his own words, when the strong men are bent, and the women who grind cease to grind because they are few, and the doors on the street are shut, and the daughters of the song are brought low. There are fears of heights and terrors. Terrors are in the road. The grasshopper drags himself along, and the mourners go about the streets, and breath returns to God who gave it. Meaningless? We may look at the world the same way, and our ministries with it. Endless pastoring, no progress, only decline. Meaningless. Fights for justice without success, meaningless. Preaching without transformation, meaningless. In our churches, and Hauerwas's words, as the preachers and the leaders, we get pecked to death by a duck. Meaningless, meaningless, meaningless. But unlike Qoheleth, we do know something more. The very God who holds time entered time. He met his creation in the midst of our oppression and in the midst of our injustice and in the midst of the meaninglessness. He entered our relentless trek towards death and submitted to its demands on his own flesh. Meaningless, meaningless, meaningless. And I preached on Sunday that our preaching is useless and so is our faith if Christ is not raised. If Christ is not raised, our preaching is useless, and so is our faith. But Christ is raised, not just in some idealized form. Christ is raised, not in some vain hope that simply inspires our moral fiber. Comrades, a real resurrection, a real reversal of death in time. Perhaps there is something new under the sun after all. There was a time to be born and a time to die, and it wasn't what we had thought or expected at all. But do we believe it? As pastors and preachers, as Christian disciples, except that we have the taste of new life on our own lips, it is meaningless. But when we taste and see that the Lord is good, well, then God invites us to do things. Our moral agency is restored, and the moral energy we need to fulfill our calling is given by the Holy Spirit, so that the things that we try to do and we know we can't and we continually fail, his power is available to do in us so much more than we could ever ask or imagine. If we have new life in us, We have a life to share. We have a joy deeper than the world's grief and sorrow. It doesn't nullify it. It meets it. Because we know God is at work, tapping us on the shoulder, using our gifts and our ability to speak life to death. If we have life within us, we're alive to God and alive to the world. And we're not in exile. We're not defeated. The church in the world is in revival globally. Revival. What we see here is not all there is. We have work to do and a reason and a joy to do it. If our preaching is being done on our own strength, we're missing the greatest power available to us to make a dramatical transformational change in our world. And if our preaching is merely addressing our comrades with the best message that humanism can muster, we should not be surprised if it feels meaningless. If the work is our work only, we are defeated before we begin. But if our work is God's work, caught up in the risen and exalted Christ, made possible in his Spirit, well, then to participate in it is a mystery and a joy. And he taps us on the shoulder. If we can slow down and quiet ourselves enough just to hear him. He hasn't gone into hiding. He isn't missing. He is everywhere at work and all around us. Do you hear him? Do you feel him? We have got to come unstuck from our endless cultural lament and look to the fields that are white for harvest. God is doing his work everywhere and always. Meaningless? The culture says so. Meaningless? We are those who bear the words of life to the world. We bear the words of life to the world. It is the opposite of meaningless. It's a seed soaked in meaning and a purpose and a kingdom. And yes, I know that Christian leaders lose the sense of rhythm. I do too. We go from grief to grief, and we go from sorrow to sorrow, and agony to agony, funeral to funeral, and we forget our first love. It feels endless and meaningless. How do you lead or preach when there's not a time for everything? But like the world, there's only a time for death, for sadness, and for grief. We sit at our desks with our head in our hands wondering, where is the hope? Where is the joy? How can we preach contagious joy when we ourselves are broken? So broken. Perhaps the muck that God cuts through in life isn't that of the world only. Perhaps it's ours first. I am tempted as a theologian, and an optimistic one, despite all this talk of meaninglessness, to want to say at this point, you with your head in your hands, lift your head, sit up straight. No, stand on your chair if you must. What do you see? Look to the horizon, strain forward, narrow your eyes. What do you see? The bright dawn of a new day. It's true. It's true. Beyond the deep pain and the darkness, beyond the brokenness and the hurt, there is a city shining in the distance that is a reality more true than what we see and touch and bear witness to in our world. This is what we bear witness to in our preaching. And I could say in Platonic fashion, now that you've glimpsed the new dawn, go forward and lead others in the glimpse. Even just a glimpse burns its hope into the darkness of a broken world. But that's not what I'm going to say, truth though it is. Rather, there is, I think, a more profound truth that is less shiny, but all the more powerful for its grittiness. As you sit at your desk with your head in your hands, you don't have to get up. You don't have to lift your head. And yet, as you sit, do you feel something? A hand on your shoulder, a gentle tap, a glimmer of hope that you are not alone. The incarnate Lord present with you. I am here. The truth that the God of creation has come to us, comes and still comes, and stands near, unexpectedly, understatedly, yet near, is the sort of practical reality that enables us to carry on. Not simply in hope of a better future, though that is surely ours. We don't need to stand to see it, because he lifts us up for a glimpse of it, like a child being lifted up to see the magic of a parade float as it passes by up over the crowd, because he then sets us down and says, "You are my hands and my feet incarnate in my world." We walk and we preach and we teach and we encourage. We cry, we grieve, and we laugh. There is still time to laugh. There is a time for all things. And joy comes in the morning, even if morning is not yet. God has made us for this time. His time is not of our choosing. In Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, Frodo reflects with Gandalf, wishing the ring had not come to him, that he had not had to be part of such a difficult and painful mission. "I wish it need not have happened in my time," said Frodo. "So do I," said Gandalf. "And so do all who live to see such times. But that is not for them to decide. All we have to decide is what to do with the time that is given us." To the glory of God.